the most original talk radio station anywhere. We are LA Talk Radio at latalkradio.com.
You're listening to The Bruce Montalvo Show, right here on LA Talk Radio.
Hello, welcome to The Bruce Montalvo Show on LA Talk Radio, now also broadcasting on AM 1050, KCAA, NBC News Radio. It's Sunday, November 25th, 2012, and on today's show, our guest is no stranger to my broadcast, having been featured many times on my show prior to syndication. Ladies and gentlemen, joining me on air today is the chairman of the Riverside County Libertarian Party, Gene Berkman. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Gene owns and operates the Renaissance Bookshop with some of the best literature in science fiction, philosophy, history, and, of course, libertarian viewpoints. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my good friend and guest on today's broadcast, Gene Berkman. Hello, Gene. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Bruce. Thanks for having me as a guest, and congratulations on your new syndicated radio program.
Thank you so much. It wouldn't have been possible without all our past collaborations, and really, I'm so happy to have you on. It's real great to have you on the show, Gene. Thank you for being on.
Well, thank you, and we need more patriots making the case for limited government and independence from the New World Order on talk radio, on the Internet, and in print. So, go Bruce.
Thank you so much, Gene. And, of course, your mentorship has meant a lot to me as well. Now, Gene, we called it a couple of months back on the broadcast. He didn't quite go up in flames, but Romney did lose. Of course, we live in a democratic state, so we have the advantage of knowing what they're going to do and what they're thinking, obviously. Can you let our listeners know exactly what you predicted, how eventually all the hoopla about Romney winning was just that, hoopla?
I knew from the beginning that Governor Romney had very little chance of defeating President Obama in this year's election, which is not a comment on how great President Obama's administration has been, but on how little Governor Romney and the Republicans offer to the American people. People want limited government, and they want some relief from the high taxes, the regulation, and the constant warfare state that the Democrats and Republicans have given us. And Governor Romney basically promised more of the same. He actually criticized proposals for cutting military spending when we spend far too much on the military. And he actually called for more government programs when people want fewer government programs. And while he did not lose by as big a margin as some people expected, he received fewer votes than John McCain received 4 years ago. And part of the reason the election was so close is that 6 million people who voted for President Obama 4 years ago did not vote for him this time. So both major parties lost support in the last 4 years. People are, in many cases, just giving up on the political process because they don't think it can solve the problems. And others are turning to the Libertarian Party and other alternatives.
Exactly. Now, Gene, it's obvious there was a media blackout of the people's president, Gary Johnson. They wouldn't even let him debate. Along with Roseanne Barr, the Constitutional Party, many other third-party members were blacklisted basically from the mainstream debate. Your thoughts?
Well, it's pretty clear that the Commission on Presidential Debates is a bipartisan political operation intended to excite people about two very unexciting choices that they have, and to make them think that there are no other choices. We're fortunate that we have other forms of communication this year. We have the Internet, we have talk radio, we have inexpensive print, and we have many alternative publications that provided coverage for the Libertarian candidates. But in fact, it's pretty clear that the mainstream media does not take the alternatives to the bipartisan party seriously, or they don't want the American people to know there is even an alternative to the bipartisan party. We're making progress, though. The Internet gives information to more and more people. Talk radio is available to more and more people. And modern communications methods will tear down the iron wall of establishment control.
Exactly. I wanted to cover your publication, a publication by you under Renaissance Book Service, a talk you gave back in December of 1992 that is now a book titled The Trilateral Commission and the New World Order. Can you let our listening audience know about that talk you gave?
In 1992, I was invited to give a presentation before the United We Stand organization in Orange County on the topic of the Trilateral Commission. And so I presented background on the Trilateral Commission and its predecessor organizations, the Council on Foreign Relations and the Royal Institute of International Affairs. The focus of the talk in 1992, since it was not too long after the first Iraq War, when President George H.W. Bush, or President Bush Sr., had organized a military action under auspices of the United Nations to drive the Iraqi military out of Kuwait. So the focus of it was on American and European policy toward the Middle East. And clearly, if one looks at the background of the Trilateral Commission, which was formed in 1973, the focus of the Trilateral Commission from the very beginning has been Middle Eastern politics and Middle Eastern oil politics in particular. In the background, it's important to note that prior to 1971, the United States provided 85% of its own oil needs, and we exported oil to the rest of the world. But the result of continuing years of printing press inflation, governments spending more money than they took in, and funding their excess by having the Federal Reserve printing fiat money and driving the value of the money down faster than people could get raises, people were faced with constant increases in the cost of living, and one very visible cost of living increase was the price of the gasoline they had to pay to get to work, to try to earn the money to keep up with inflation. To attempt to symbolically deal with this inflation, President Richard M. Nixon, a Republican, imposed price controls on oil produced in the United States and sold in the United States. The price controls exempted imported oil, which could be purchased at world market prices, and it exempted American oil, which was sold in the world market. So the multinational oil companies shifted from maintaining American energy independence, which we were doing so well at prior to 1971, and they began importing huge quantities of oil from the Middle East, and thus the Middle East became the central focus of world politics since the mid-1970s. And we can see the danger in being dependent for our energy needs on a region run by reactionary dictators, nationalist demagogues parading as socialists or communist beacons of the future, and people who are prone to resort to violence rather than talking out their disputes. And the Trilateral Commission has attempted to coordinate the policies of the American, European, and Japanese governments toward this volatile region to ensure oil supplies for the industrialized countries. It's the American policy in the Middle East, under the direction of the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations agents, is a poor substitute for restoring a free market which would bring about energy independence for America through domestically produced oil and through other domestic energy sources. So the focus of my talk was on American, European, and Japanese policy as coordinated by the Trilateral Commission toward the Middle East oil-producing countries.
Very good. Now, Gene, I want to cover this chapter in your book titled "Bipartisan Support for the New World Order." Now, every president since Ronald Reagan has had bipartisan support for these global oligarchs. Now, can you let our listening audience know about that chapter in your book?
Yes, I'll be glad to. The Democratic and Republican parties are not sharply defined philosophical societies. They are organizations whose main goal is attaining and keeping political power. They use philosophical notions, ideological concepts, and more to the point, interest group affiliations and interest group needs and desires to manipulate people into supporting one side or the other in an election. But regardless of who is elected, there's a permanent bureaucracy, a permanent foreign affairs elite that advises the president and the administration regardless of what party is in power. And they have a goal of maintaining American influence in the world at large, maintaining American coordination with the European and Japanese governments, and maintaining access to the flow of oil from the Middle East and other third world countries. The result of this has been, regardless of Republican rhetoric about maintaining national independence, the Republican presidents put more and more faith in the United Nations and NATO as a means of organizing the world. And regardless of Democrats such as Obama being elected with the support of anti-war voters who want American troops pulled out of the Middle East, we still see permanent military bases in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other countries, and we still see a permanent policy of maintaining friendship and supplying military equipment and even police equipment to some of the most repressive governments in the world. President Nixon began the policy of American friendship with Saudi Arabia, one of the most repressive and reactionary regimes in the world, and President Obama early in his administration announced that we would sell $60 billion worth of military equipment to the oppressive regime in Saudi Arabia. So it's very clear that both Democratic and Republican presidents have maintained this policy of friendship with repressive governments in the Middle East in order to ensure access to Middle Eastern oil, and sometimes in order to make claims about strategic needs in the area. But the real goal is the Middle Eastern oil and the wealth that goes with it. And the only hope for the American people is a multi-partisan or non-partisan opposition. Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Libertarians, Greens, etc. have to put the interests of American independence and international peace ahead of whatever they think their party loyalty is. And so we promote, in opposition to the bipartisan party, a policy of America first, American independence, and American economic freedom.
Now, Gene, we also promote as libertarians the philosophy of non-interventionism. It seems that President Obama does not, as a constitutional professor, I believe he does not adhere to the Constitution at all. He recently, I saw news that all media outlets are saying he gave $70 million to the state of Israel, but it's really $70 billion. Your thoughts on that?
Okay, I have not seen specific numbers lately. I know that every year the United States provides billions of dollars in military aid to the state of Israel, and that is actually a policy that is widely accepted by the American people. It does lead to problems. We are seen as not as an even-handed power that wishes to see peace in the Middle East involving both sides. We're seen as being on one side, and clearly the American people, if we have any sympathy at all, it is with the people of Israel who have closer cultural ties to us and who have, as repressive as their government is, a less oppressive government than any other in the Middle East. But it does lead to a perception that we cannot be an even-handed broker in things. And if we can't be an even-handed broker, then we should be a non-broker. We should not be intervening because our goal is American independence and American peace. Other people should have their own goal. The people of Israel should have the goal of an independent Israel. The people in Egypt certainly have the goal of an independent Egypt. And we can hardly advance their goals if we are seen as being unnecessarily or prejudicially favoring one side over the other. So our goal is a policy of non-intervention because it's the only way we can make clear that America wants to be friends with the world, economic traders with the world, but military allies of no one. This is the policy that George Washington suggested over 200 years ago, and it served America well for many years. And in the wake of World War I and the creation of the Council on Foreign Relations and the constant lobbying to involve America in the world in order to prove we're a great power, we've seen a decline from the friendship and influence that we had with the world to the point where many people in the world think America's a bully, think America sides with bullies, think America sides with their own oppressive governments. When the people of Egypt rose up to overthrow President Hosni Mubarak, who had maintained an oppressive regime in power for decades, they saw him as a friend of the United States, and we are lucky that the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood has moderated and has encouraged their people not to hate America, because the normal result of a revolution of the type they had in Egypt would be that they would hate everybody that gave any support to the repressive regime that they had in power. But we can head off this problem in the future by not aiding repressive regimes, by not helping people stay in power against the will of their own people. And so our goal as libertarians is, in fact, non-intervention, friendship and peace with the entire world, entangling alliances with no one.
Truly a vision of America at peace with the world, right, Gene?
Exactly. Peace with the world and freedom in America.
Absolutely. Now, Gene, I wanted to discuss the roles of Germany and Japan and the roles that these two countries play in the Trilateral Commission, which is also featured in your publication. Your thoughts?
It's very interesting development. As anybody who's read history books, and of course people my age grew up watching World War II movies on television, World War II was the biggest political and military action in the history of the world. And in that action, it was America and Britain against Germany and Japan. Germany and Japan lost the war, but they seem to have won the peace. Germany is now a vibrant, dynamic industrial economy because in the post-war world, the people who had been oppressed by the Nazis took power, and they implemented a government that was limited and committed to free market economics. They built up a strong industry. In Japan, through a more interventionist, regimented corporate state, they built up a strong industry too. And so when the Trilateral Commission was created in 1973, while it was supposedly America, Europe, and Japan, it was predominantly America, Germany, and Japan because of German economic power and Japanese economic power. The crucial point about the role of the Trilateral Commission and the ideology that goes along with it is that in the post-war world, Germany and Japan had both committed themselves to foreign policies of peace and the policy of maintaining a limited military, limited to the power to defend their own countries. Both Germany and Japan had a policy of never allowing their troops on foreign soil. But in the wake of the Iraq War in 1990, the U.S. government began putting pressure on Germany and Japan to rearm, and they began putting pressure on Germany and Japan to amend their own constitutions to allow them to send their military into other countries. And the tragedy is that in the wake of President George W. Bush's second Iraq War, Germany has sent non-combatant military forces into the Middle East. It has sent combatant military forces into Afghanistan as part of the War on Terror. And in Asia, Japan has sent military forces into Cambodia to help enforce the post-Khmer Rouge regime. Now, there may be some good that can be conceived as coming from this, but it breaks the principle of Germany and Japan not sending troops outside their own borders. And we saw what happened in the 1930s and 40s when Germany and Japan sent troops outside their borders, and the people of both countries know that that is a recipe for tragedy. So it is an ironical result of the Trilateral Commission and its use of the United Nations that Germany and Japan would both be rearming and both putting themselves in a position where they can militarily intervene in other countries. This is two more reasons that those of us who advocate freedom and international peace must oppose the New World Order.
Well, Gene, you also wrote in your publication that the UN, which it's clear they want to use drones now. I mean, it doesn't get any more tyrannical than that. The role of the UN and their limiting of national sovereignty. Your thoughts?
It's another irony. The United Nations, when I was growing up, the United Nations was promoted in our elementary schools, our junior high schools, and our high schools as mankind's last best hope for peace. But the actual origin of the United Nations is as a wartime military alliance. When America, Britain, and Russia allied militarily to fight Germany and Japan in World War II, the name of the alliance was the United Nations. People don't realize that. It's not commonly stressed in our history books, but it's an indisputable historical fact. And the United Nations organization that was founded in San Francisco in 1946 by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union under Comrade Stalin was a continuation of the wartime military alliance. And the original proposal included calling for the United Nations to have its own military force. In the 1948 elections, the Democratic Party platform called for the United Nations to have its own military force. In the very same elections, the Republican Party platform called for the United Nations to have its own military force. And the platform of Henry Wallace's Progressive Party, which was organized by the Communist Party of the United States, called for the United Nations to have its own military force. Over the years, instead, the United Nations Security Council has called upon the military forces of member nations to intervene, as it authorized the United States and NATO forces to bomb Yugoslavia, for example, or as it authorized the United States and Allied military forces to confront Iraq in 1991, for example. But there has been a continuing promotion since 1946 of the idea of the United Nations having its own military force. And when we consider how little control we as Americans have over our own elected representatives, to think that we or any other people in the world could control the unappointed, unelected bureaucrats who run the United Nations offices in New York City when they have control of the military, that is just crazy. It is bad enough that our own government violates our own Constitution, but the United Nations Charter doesn't even have the limitations our Constitution has. So this is an even more important issue to deal with. We must stop the United Nations from creating its own military, and it's on the drawing boards now, and it's being implemented now.
You know, Gene, you get a bunch of Marxist nations together, and they try to come up with the solution for liberty.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. The Marxist nations in various third world countries, of course, we have ruling elites who imbibe their Marxism not at Moscow University. They imbibed their Marxism at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology or at the University of California. We have our own colleges here, our own colleges in Western Europe, non-communist Europe supposedly, our own colleges in Japan, where most of the professors in the economics departments, most of the professors in the political science departments consider themselves Marxists. And we have the elite students from Asia and Africa attending these colleges and returning home with this belief that central planning, that state planning of the economy, that central planning of social development, that government planning of urban growth is the key to the future, and that the only way to develop an economy is through a strong state owning factories. And then they claim that this Marxism will give this independence from the Western imperialists, and yet the failures of the Marxist economic program mean that these very Marxist elites must put their hands out to ask for aid from the American and European governments that they so recently denounced as imperialist. So Marxism in the third world countries just provides another means of integrating these kleptocratic elites into a worldwide ruling class in which they are the subsidiaries of the American and British ruling elites in New York, London, and Paris.
Absolutely.
It's ironic, isn't it?
It is. It's downright comedic. That's what
it is. And you have to laugh or you'd cry.
Exactly. Now, Gene, let's cover your another chapter in your book titled "Oil and Money." Now, it's obvious that I'm going to quote Oliver Stone's JFK here: the organizing structure of any society is for war, and of course, oil and money play a big part of that. Can you tell us about the Trilateral Commission and their big oil ties?
Well, it's very clear that you cannot have a modern industrial society without energy. Energy runs the world. Energy makes our life easier. Energy makes it possible to produce the mass of consumer goods that we all take for granted in America, Europe, and Japan. But having access to that energy is a constant issue. Now, as I said, prior to 1971, when America had a free market, we provided 85% of our own oil needs. Had we continued, now admittedly we did import some of our own oil needs, and we exported some oil too, but had we continued with this largely independent, self-reliant provision of our own oil needs, that would have given us the space to develop the other forms of energy that we are of late working on: solar power, wind energy, liquefied natural gas, and other forms of energy, and hopefully in the near future the hydrogen-based economy. But the disruption created by President Nixon's imposition of price controls and by the continuing intervention of American and European governments on their own oil industries has led to an extraordinary dependence on countries in the Middle East and other third world countries, including Indonesia and Venezuela, and for that matter, Russia, which is an oil exporter. Since I wrote my booklet, things have changed even for the worse. One of the side effects of President George W. Bush's ill-timed intervention against Iraq is destabilization of world oil markets in the early parts of the 21st century, with the result that the price of oil, which had been around $30 a barrel, went to over $100 a barrel. At one time, it reached $160 to $180 a barrel, and the effect of that was to provide huge amounts of money to the governments of Iran, Venezuela, and Russia. Iran, as we know, is run by a group of mullahs who practice the extreme form of Islam and who, for reasons largely caused by our own failed diplomacy, take an anti-American stand.
Exactly.
Now, admittedly, regardless of how bad their government is, if we were friendly with them, they'd be friendly with us. In Venezuela, they have a military dictator who claims to be a Marxist, and he's making billions off the high price of oil. And then Russia is run by Vladimir Putin, a career KGB officer who claims to no longer be a communist, but certainly knows how to run a communist-type repressive regime, and he's making billions off the huge run-up in the price of oil caused by President Bush's policies. So the situation is actually worse than it was when I wrote my book.
Wow. Now, Gene, in your book, the title here states "The Subordination of Ronald Reagan." Now, it's obvious he even said it himself. He said that the Taliban were the equivalent of our founding fathers. Now, he gets a pass as the father of Reaganomics, but there's a lot of information, and we've covered this before on our broadcasts. There's a lot of information that it's not mainstream, that they don't talk about. Can you let our listeners know about that information?
As anybody in my age group remembers, millions of Americans voted for Ronald Reagan in the hope that we would have limited government and free markets, and even a responsible foreign policy at a time when our politicians were demonizing the Middle Eastern oil countries for raising the price of oil in response to huge worldwide demand. Ronald Reagan pointed out this was a market phenomenon. If people are going to buy oil and the value of the dollar was going to go down, naturally the producers of oil would ask for more money. And in his campaign, Ronald Reagan advocated reasonable policies, including a return to a gold-based currency to stabilize the dollar so that the price of oil would not continue going up. But in power, he faced the permanent bureaucracy and the permanent foreign policy elite, both inside and outside the government, and he faced a situation of American dependence on foreign oil companies that was beyond anything he could do anything about. President Reagan did decontrol the price of oil. The price of gasoline did go down when Ronald Reagan became president. The dependence of America on foreign oil did go down for some time when Ronald Reagan became president. But over time, the permanent foreign policy elite reasserted itself, and given the situation in the Middle East of Soviet intervention in Afghanistan and his own long-term commitment to anti-communist rhetoric, Ronald Reagan was convinced to support Islamic radicals in Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union. It's eerie in retrospect in the wake of 9/11, when Islamic radicals who had been given harbor in Afghanistan were seen as the culprits, that we had one of the most beloved presidents in America providing military aid to such Islamic radicals. At the same time, in the shadow of America having sent 500,000 troops in 1990 to confront the military force of Saddam Hussein, many people don't realize that from 1983 to 1989, President Reagan had authorized shipment of free military aid at U.S. taxpayers' expense to the very regime of Saddam Hussein as part of our attempt to counter the Iranian government in the Middle East. Basically, we have people who do not have a deep understanding of the history of the Middle Eastern region, trying to manipulate things and thinking they know more than the people who actually live there, how those people should live their lives, and thinking that they know more than the people involved in the international oil trade, how to ensure access to energy for American consumers. And we've had one tragedy after another. Let me repeat. Ronald Reagan ordered the supply of military aid at United States taxpayers' expense to the Iraqi regime of Saddam Hussein, and President Ronald Reagan ordered the supply of military aid to Islamic radicals in Afghanistan. And today we are living down the effects of confronting a strong military of Saddam Hussein, and we are living down the effects of Islamic radicalism in the Middle East. it just shows no matter how smart you are, the world is smarter than you are.
Exactly. Now, Gene, again, he was being run by, again, Daddy Bush. It's that Daddy Bush element in the government that's running things, right?
Well, indeed. Gary Allen, the writer for American Opinion, noted that the victory for constitutional conservatism that Ronald Reagan won when he received the Republican nomination for president in 1980, he immediately threw away when he put George Herbert Walker Bush on the ticket for vice president. George Herbert Walker Bush could never have been elected on his own. He was massively defeated in the Republican primaries throughout 1980 by Ronald Reagan, and he would have had no political future had Ronald Reagan not chosen him for vice president. But on Reagan's coattails, George Bush Sr. was elected president in 1988, and by 1990, in fact, by September 11th, 1990, President George Herbert Walker Bush was announcing that we are on the verge of a new world order, which was a world run by the military and political force of the United Nations under an alliance of the United States and Russia. And we have seen changes since that time, but who is the powerful player in the world today? The United Nations and the powerful economic players besides Germany and Japan are the oil-producing countries, including Russia, which is exporting billions of dollars worth of oil and using that money to build up its own military. We see Russia constantly exerting itself. We had thought after the collapse of the Soviet Union that Russia would turn inward and build itself up and try to get out of the poverty that 70 years of communism had left it in. But now we see everywhere in the world, when the United States intervenes, often mistakenly, the Russians take advantage of this to go to the other side and say, "Well, we're on your side." When President George Walker Bush was planning an attack on Iraq, Russia was providing military intelligence to Iraq to counter it. When the United States is saying to the Israelis and Palestinians, let's sit down at the table and work out your disputes, the Russians are offering military aid to Palestinian extremist groups. So we see a symbiotic relationship, sort of like sumo wrestlers. They look like they're fighting, but they're actually just helping each other to stay in the ring of America, Russia, and the United Nations. And that's the sort of much in need of repair, much in need of spackling and lacquering New World Order that the two Bush administrations have bequeathed to the United States.
Absolutely. Now, Gene, I wanted to get your thoughts on Ron Paul's recent farewell speech. Now, it's obvious how much he means to the libertarian movement, to the liberty-minded American citizenry and the global citizenry worldwide who advocates for freedom. Your thoughts?
Congressman Ron Paul has been an outstanding champion of freedom, free market economics, and international peace for his entire political career. It's ironic for somebody who served so many years in Congress as a Republican that he decided to go into politics in response to President Richard Nixon, Republican, imposing price controls or wage and price controls in 1971. The price controls on the oil weren't the only controls. President Nixon imposed wage controls on American workers. He imposed price controls on American consumer goods. And the effect of this, of course, is devastating. Very few of your listeners are probably old enough to remember driving long distances in 1972 or 1973 and wondering whether you would find a gas station that had any gasoline in it. There were times when people found themselves in gas lines because the gas stations could not pay for gasoline because the world market price was too high and the limited, restricted price Americans were allowed to pay was too low. So this is what motivated Dr. Ron Paul, a obstetrician gynecologist, to enter politics, when his first preference would just be to continue in his own chosen profession. Ron Paul is not a normal politician, and he's not somebody who really likes politics. He's somebody who likes the intellectual endeavor of proving how effective the free market is in satisfying the needs and desires of people. But he's in politics as a defensive thing because the government is too big, and Americans who believe in limited government have to use the political arena to fight back. And he's dedicated his life to this since 1971. So we can all thank Congressman Ron Paul for his many years of service in Congress. And, of course, after many years of being diplomatic with Democrat and Republican members, he would work with Democrats to try to oppose the war. He would work with Republicans to try to oppose government intervention in the economy. But in his farewell address, he was able to finally make clear that he felt himself on many issues very alone in a Congress full of people whose concern was not individual freedom or even any kind of philosophical consistency. Their concern was being reelected, and their concern was getting special favors for their own district at the expense of the rest of the American people. And so his farewell address will be rare in the annals of farewell addresses to Congress in being so straightforward and so straight-shooting in laying out the problems that many, many years of constantly expanding government and constantly expanding international interventionism have left to America. And we can just hope that some of the protégés of Ron Paul, Congressman Justin Amish of Michigan most notably, can take up the torch in Congress while other protégés, such as Governor Gary Johnson of New Mexico, outside Congress, can take up the torch by building the Libertarian Party in the memory of Congressman Ron Paul and the others who have built the Libertarian Party in the past. I'll remind everybody, in 1988, Congressman Ron Paul was the Libertarian Party's candidate for president, and he helped bring the party from obscurity at the time into being a factor in the fringe movement for limited constitutional government, which is soon to be a mainstream movement for limited constitutional government, thanks to the work of Congressman Ron Paul, Governor Gary Johnson, and many others.
Absolutely. Now, Gene, I have to cover this. Rand Paul, it's obvious he sold out to the Republican establishment this year. He did not campaign. Ron Paul, his father, did not campaign nearly enough in California or his home state of Texas. What do you say to those who say that both Rand Paul and Ron Paul might be compromised in any way? There's also, history linking them to esoteric societies. Your thoughts?
Congressman Ron Paul is pretty busy most of the time promoting free market economics and limited constitutional government, and I'm not sure what other social affiliations he has. Rand Paul is clearly new to politics, new to elective office, that is to say. He certainly has been politically involved for many years, and he wants to get ahead, and he's doing it, sadly, in the most traditional way, which is through loyalty to a major political party. The true defender of freedom cannot have loyalty to a party. The loyalty to a principle is far more important. I've been in the Libertarian Party for many years, but if there is a Republican who is for limited government, I will consider supporting him. If there's a Democrat who seriously is anti-war, I will work with him. Senator Rand Paul has unfortunately seen that loyalty to a party can be rewarding, and he thinks it will reward him by moving him up the ladder. What he's going to find out in the future is, yes, he can talk about how great Mitt Romney is, but he better stop talking about it now, because none of the other Republicans are talking that way now that Romney is a loser, and possibly he guessed wrong in being so quick to jump on the Romney bandwagon, which is going nowhere. We can hope Senator Paul becomes more secure in his political popularity and more secure in his office so that he can become more like his father, Ron Paul. But there is a generation gap, and we all see generation gaps in our own lives, and in the meantime, if I were Congressman Ron Paul, certainly there are times when I think I have no son, but we can hope for Rand Paul, but I certainly would not want to send a political contribution to him anytime in the near future after he stabbed us in the back by supporting Governor Mitt Romney for president.
Absolutely.
He can excuse it as he was helping the Republican Party. He can excuse it as he was trying to defeat Obama. But it was clear that Governor Romney provided no opportunity in either case. So, sad news for you, Senator Paul.
Now, Gene, it's clear that in this year's election, freedom was the alternative, with Governor Gary Johnson, former governor of New Mexico, Gary Johnson, attaining 1 million votes. Now, that's the first time in history that a Libertarian candidate has generated that many votes. Your thoughts?
It's the first time a Libertarian candidate for president has achieved that many votes. In this election, actually, 7 Libertarian candidates around the country received more than 1 million votes.
Wow.
In Georgia, a candidate for Public Service Commission received over 1 million votes in just part of the state of Georgia. In Texas, 5 statewide Libertarian candidates, several running for Supreme Court and a couple running for Utility Commission, received over 1 million votes each. And Governor Gary Johnson has received at least 1,300,000 votes. Now, in an election with over 100 million people voting, yes, that only amounts to around 1%. But the fact is, it reflects more than the 1,300,000 votes that he received, because everybody knows you're constantly told by your friends and by the media you are wasting your vote if you vote for a third party. Why do you want to not affect the election? Why do you not want to choose the lesser of two evils, even if you can't decide who's the lesser of two evils? And so for every vote Governor Johnson got, there might be 2, 3, or 4 other people who think, he was probably the best choice, or the Libertarians had the best proposals, but I don't want to waste my vote. So the importance of the presidential campaign was exposing the Libertarian message to tens of millions of Americans, and Governor Johnson did that. We got even higher votes for candidates running for U.S. Senate in Indiana, Montana, and Missouri. Our candidates for U.S. Senate received between 6 and 7% of the vote. Still low, but when you consider there were probably 2 or 3 times that many voters who wanted to vote for him but were afraid of wasting their vote. This is the beginning. The two-party system is very strong, and part of the strength is that we're constantly told how strong the two-party system is. But when you consider the millions of Americans who voted for Libertarian candidates, the hundreds of thousands who voted for Green Party candidates, and the probably 6 or 7 million Americans who voted 4 years ago who refused to vote this time because they gave up, there is a huge potential for a resistance to the bipartisan New World Order that is running America.
Absolutely.
And the Libertarian Party is just beginning to build on it.
Well, Gene, unfortunately, we're out of time, but it is great to officially be on air with you. You have been a great friend and a true mentor to me. Thank you, Gene, for being on my show today.
Well, thank you for having me, and let me tell everybody, if they're interested in finding out about the New World Order, they can go to www.renbook.com, that's RENBOOK.com, and order books on the New World Order, or they can go to CALibertarianAlliance.com, my California Libertarian Alliance blog, and get information on current politics, the bipartisan push for big government and the multi-partisan opposition to it, and educate themselves. We must know ourselves about it before we can tell our friends. And you're doing an outstanding job informing the public about the New World Order and the Libertarian alternative to it. So keep on going, Bruce. You have a great show.
Thank you, Gene. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to us today. Again, we broadcast 12 noon Pacific Standard Time here on LA Talk Radio, and at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on KCAA 1050 AM NBC News Radio. Now, again, as always, I'm Bruce Montalvo, reminding you that the freedom of the press is our right and our responsibility. Till next time.
You're listening to The Bruce Montalvo Show, right here on LA Talk Radio.